Good afternoon. I'm John Marchari, head of the Drawings and Prints Department here at the Morgan, and I'd like to welcome you to the first public program in connection with our exhibition, Hogarth, Cruelty and Humor. The exhibition is built around 6 red chalk drawings in the Morgan's collection, 2 for Bier Street and Gin Lane, and 4 for the stages of Cruelty. These have been in the collection since 1909, when Pierpont Morgan acquired them from the collection of Charles Fairfax Murray, but as far as we're aware, they have never been exhibited. My colleague, Jennifer Tonkovich, the Eugene and Claire Thaw curator of drawings, had long hoped to feature the drawings in an exhibition, and we're delighted that this has finally come to pass. I need to give her primary credit for the project and for organizing the loans from Yale, the Met, and the Royal Collection. Soon after Jennifer began work on the show, though, Laurel Peterson came to the Morgan as the Moore Curatorial Fellow. She received her PhD from Yale in 2018 and also holds MA and BA degrees from Yale and also an MA from the Courtauld. A British art and 18th century specialist who had previously worked at the Yale Center for British Art, Laurel soon became involved in the exhibition, and in today's lecture, she will reveal some of the research she and others have done into Hogarth's drawings and into the preparatory process for his prints. As is usual for our lunchtime lectures, we'll not take questions from the floor after the talk, but Laurel will come up to the lobby and answer questions there. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge that today's lecture is co-sponsored by the Sir John Soanes Museum Foundation. Without further delay, though, let's get to the lecture and welcome Laurel to the podium for a talk entitled Crafting Cruelty, Hogarth's Innovative Drawing Methods. Laurel.
Good afternoon, and thank you, John, for that introduction. My talk today is part of a developing conversation, as John mentioned, and it owes a great deal to the discussions, observations, and research done by and in collaboration with others. Foremost among them is Jennifer Tonkovich, who John has already mentioned, who really first saw the potential in the Morgan's Hogarth drawings and who became their champion. And I think to scholars of British art, myself included, this display of Hogarth's draftsmanship is, I think, a revelation. In working on the exhibition, we've also had the help of conservators here and at the Yale Center for British Art, Reba Fishman-Snyder, Lindsay Tyne, and Teresa Fairbanks-Harris. I'm also grateful for conversations with Meredith Gamer, Assistant Professor of Art History at Columbia. And I hope your curiosity is piqued today and that you'll return on September 12th to hear her lecture entitled Hogarth, Cruelty and Crime, where she will explore the origins, evolution, and multi-layered meanings of William Hogarth's 4 stages of cruelty. But let us now turn to Hogarth and his drawings. At the heart of the exhibition upstairs, a startling scene catches our eye. In the midst of a crowded London street, a woman sits on the stairs. Her ragged clothes are in disarray, the top of her dress opened, her sagging breasts presumably exposed to feed her child. Yet, as she reaches to take a pinch of snuff, her infant falls from her arms, tumbling to the gutter below. Observing the scene, we may be the only ones who have noticed this catastrophic fall. The skeletal man in the foreground sleeps in a drunken stupor, clutching his bottle of gin. We come to understand that this alcoholic beverage is at the root of the social disorder and strife that fills this London street. Outside the Kilman distiller, a chillingly named purveyor of gin, men brawl wildly with furniture and crutches, while gin is tipped into the mouth of a man sitting in a wheelbarrow. A suicide hangs from the rafters above, and in front of the crumbling buildings, a body is laid in a casket. To the right, a starving boy shares a bone with a dog. And a couple brings pots, pans, and clothing to the pawnbroker, whose building stands out for its thriving state, a contrast to the collapsed roofs and crumbling walls in the background. The British artist William Hogarth produced this drawing in late 1750 or early 1751 in response to the very real contemporary problem of gin consumption. Since gin's introduction to England around 1700, its popularity had soared. Cheap to distill and quick to intoxicate, this highly alcoholic beverage had produced something of an epidemic in the country, particularly among the poor, whose dependence on the beverage resulted in the pawning of the most essential goods and in the neglect of their children. To emphasize gin's devastating effects, Hogarth produced a drawing to highlight the benefits of another beverage, beer. On this London street, well-fed, smiling men and women consume tankards of ale. They contribute positively to the city's economy, selling shoes and fish. New buildings are erected, and the only struggling business is the pawn shop. Oh, sorry. The pawn shop you can see just indicated by its sign here. With it has partially a boarded up window and a sign askew. In mid-18th century England, beer was the most commonly consumed beverage by people of all ages. Much safer than water and frequently having a low alcohol content, beer served as a hydrating and even nutritious beverage, a stark contrast to gin. Hogarth made these red chalk drawings while in the process of designing a pair of prints. He hoped that the contrasting imagery would draw attention to the ruinous effects of gin. He etched and engraved the copper plates himself, making edits and changes as he did so. He was exacting in his attention to details. For example, in the margin of the Gin Street drawing, Hogarth redrew the hand of the pawnbroker holding a saw. Apparently dissatisfied with his initial rendering, Hogarth wanted to make sure he had the hand as he wanted it for the print. On view in the exhibition, the copper plate for Gin Lane, the work's final title, shows the finished results, which includes the addition of syphilitic sores on the central woman's leg, emphasizing her desperation. After he was finished engraving, Hogarth made the prints, inking the plate and using a printing press to impress the design on a sheet of paper, resulting in the completed prints, which sold for $1 apiece. Today, the prints of Bier Street and Gin Lane remain some of the most iconic images of 18th century England, used in everything from history textbooks to novels. Gin Lane even inspired a recent gin bottle label, somewhat unconcerned, perhaps, with the negative side of this beverage. The prints have details that fascinate, entertain, and horrify, giving them their staying power, and perhaps making us glad that we live in the 21st century. The stories that emerge from the details in Hogarth's art have helped to make him one of Britain's best-known artists. He is perhaps best known for his narrative series, or as he called them, modern moral subject pictures, a genre of his own invention. In The Rake's Progress at the Soanes Museum, a group of 8 paintings tracks the downward spiral of a young man too quick to spend his money. Though he makes the effort to become part of a polite society, he squanders his fortune, ending his days in Bedlam. As we follow the story, details bring it to life, from scenes of excess drinking to the lascivious look cast by the rake at the young girl, which is then echoed in the lower right corner by 2 dogs. Hogarth's paintings have such a popular appeal that they were worthy even of a special edition of Doc Martens. But beyond popular attention, Hogarth's rich paintings and prints have made him the subject of study by scholars of art history, of literature, of history, and of culture. Yet despite scores of volumes dedicated to his artistic output, very little attention has been paid to his work as a draftsman. The most comprehensive publication on Hogarth's drawings was published by Paul Ape more than 70 years ago in 1948. The drawings are due for a reevaluation, for their variety and originality. About 100 or so of Hogarth's drawings survive, and they range from brief sketches to more highly finished print studies. They're drawn in graphite, chalk, ink, and wash. The few examples I'm showing here demonstrate that Hogarth was a lively, inventive draftsman, using diverse approaches to achieve his desired effects. The exhibition upstairs and my talk today focuses on 6 red chalk drawings here in the Morgan's collection: Bier Street, Gin Lane, and the 4 Stages of Cruelty, all of which were produced between 1750 and 1751. These highly finished drawings, rendered with exacting detail, provide evidence for understanding how Hogarth worked out his drawings. As we will see, his development of compositions was never linear, but often doubled back on itself. It involved thinking and rethinking, drawing and redrawing, fitting for an artist whose power came from his details. Yet, as I shall also argue, these drawings are more than just rough drafts or models for finished prints. Carefully worked in red chalk, a medium that Hogarth used increasingly at this time, they are more ambitious than has perhaps been previously recognized, precisely because of their medium. But most importantly, they provide the opportunity to look again at some of Hogarth's iconic images and to see them in fresh, new ways. William Hogarth was born in London in 1697. His father was by turns a schoolmaster, a coffeehouse owner, and a Latin teacher, but he never enjoyed great professional success. When William was 10, his father fell deep into debt and was confined to a debtor's prison. When the family's situation improved, at age 16, William was bound as an apprentice to Ellis Gamble, a silver engraver. But he had dreams beyond this humble work. Rather than wanting to spend his life engraving letters and heraldic devices on dinnerware and other silver, he wanted to produce works of art of his own invention. So 5 years into his 7-year apprenticeship, Hogarth broke with Gamble and set up his own shop as a copper engraver and printmaker. He printed his own trade card shortly thereafter, where his elegantly engraved name is flanked by the figure of art on the left and history on the right, an early statement of his artistic and intellectual intentions, as well as a demonstration of his skill in various engraving techniques and lettering. Satirical prints were among Hogarth's first works, and one of his earliest surviving drawings relates to such a print and is in the exhibition on loan from the Royal Collection at Windsor. In 1720, Europe experienced a financial crisis with the collapse of a speculation scheme. Investments made in the South Sea Company, a merchant trading company, had proved worthless, and European markets collapsed, leaving many investors destitute. This crash was one of the earliest instances of a financial bubble bursting, a phenomenon that is now all too familiar to us. As we see in the drawing and in the print, to demonstrate the impact of the crisis and its devastating effects, Hogarth blended together allegorical figures with scenes of life from contemporary London. A whirling merry-go-round at the center suggests the frenzy of the scheme. The plinth on the right in the print and on the left in the drawing would have been immediately familiar to Londoners as the base of the monument to the Fire of London, locating the scene within a recognizable setting and adding a sense of contemporaneity. But it is with allegory that Hogarth makes his strongest critique. At the center, we see honesty bound to a wheel of fortune, beaten by the figure of self-interest. Before the monument, the figure of honor is being scourged by villainy. Honor and honesty are the casualties of fevered, unpredictable speculation. Beyond allegory, with these figures, Hogarth also signals something of his artistic ambitions. Unlike the caricatured figures of Londoners who fill the street with their exaggerated physiognomies and squat, plump physiques, these allegorical figures in the nude represent attempts at figure drawing, similar to the kind that might be learned in an art academy. The figure of honor with the bare back even recalls imagery from earlier art, such as Rubens's Flagellation of Christ. Even on a small scale, Hogarth had his sights set on bigger things. The London art world at this moment was highly cosmopolitan, comprising artists from the Netherlands, Italy, France, as well as from England. However, there was no central formalized setting for the instruction of art. France had had a Royal Academy which instructed young artists in painting, drawing, and sculpture since 1648, and such academies had existed in Italy since the 16th century. Britain's Royal Academy, on the other hand, would not be founded until 1768, 4 years after Hogarth's death. Yet, despite the lack of a centralized school for art, Hogarth had the opportunity to learn from a range of artists through more informal drawing academies and clubs in London, such as the St. Martin's Lane Academy, which he joined in October 1720, shortly after it was founded. Informal academies provided artists the opportunity to draw from life, and in England, unlike in France, artists were able to draw from not only male models, but also female ones. Apparently, this encouraged attendance. When Hogarth produced his sheet for the South Sea Bubble, he had likely already had some exposure to life drawing, but as the slightly awkward representations of the bodies we saw suggest, he was still learning his trade. Yet he quickly became a competent draftsman, forging his own style. His drawings of female bodies at the Academy are loosely rendered in a naturalistic style. These are in contrast to the Academy's principal drawing instructor, Louis Chéron, whose figure drawing appears much more like a classical statue than a flesh and blood woman. When Hogarth began his artistic education, there were very few native-born English artists on whom he could model a career. The exception was Sir James Thornhill, a decorative history painter known for his exuberant, colorful murals in the dining hall at the Royal Naval College in Greenwich. Hogarth had admired these works during his apprenticeship, but by 1720, this style of painting had fallen from fashion. Although Hogarth would ally himself with Thornhill, eloping with his daughter Jane in 1729, to be successful as an artist, he needed a different tactic, and he explored a range of artistic genres, even crafting his own. Beyond satirical prints, Hogarth began to branch out into various forms of painting. One of his earliest successes was a painting of the theatrical performance of John Gay's Beggar's Opera, and he also began producing conversation pieces, which are a genre of group portraiture. In the 1730s, he started developing the modern moral subjects, such as the Rake's Progress, which we have already seen. These were then engraved, further enlarging Hogarth's audience and his customer base. He would go on to paint portraits of single individuals and even to try his hand at history painting. He was an artist for whom variety was incredibly important. When Hogarth painted the self-portrait on display in the exhibition, he had become a leader in the London art world. With a palette and wig, he presents himself as a gentleman painter. Upon Thornhill's death in 1734, he inherited his father-in-law's apparatus for a drawing school and established his own academy in St. Martin's Lane, not far from the place where he had first studied. He also sought to protect artist rights. In 1735, Hogarth led a group of artists to petition for an Engravers Act. This group wanted to protect the inventors and engravers of original designs, arguing that it was the efforts of the artist that gave the print any value over, quote, another common piece of paper. Hogarth himself was motivated to campaign for this Copyright Act after his series, The Harlot's Progress, had been pirated before its publication. The act was intended to protect against such piracy, stressing in particular the rights of the artist who had invented the design. Even as Hogarth was ambitious, constantly seeking new patrons and new means of producing art, he was increasingly concerned by social issues in London. In 1739, he became one of the governors of the Foundling Hospital, London's first dedicated home for orphan children. Gin Lane, Bier Street, and the 4 stages of cruelty also demonstrate Hogarth's social concerns. In the late 1740s and early 1750s, there was increasing anxiety in London over crime and violence in the city and its environs. In London, the population had swelled, resulting in overcrowding and an increasingly impoverished lower class. Both Hogarth and his friend, the novelist and magistrate Henry Fielding, were concerned about this social decay and sought to address it. Fielding published a tract entitled An Inquiry into the Causes of the Late Increase of Robbers in January 1751, and the following month, Hogarth advertised the prints Bier Street, Gin Lane, and the 4 Stages of Cruelty. The prints carried a clear social agenda. The first pair, as we've seen, were were designed to address gin drinking. The set of 4, known as the 4 stages of cruelty, looked at broader, more violent social ills, underlining the connection, in part, between animal cruelty and criminality. Hogarth hoped that these would circulate broadly, for, as he advertised, they were calculated to reform some reigning vices peculiar to the lower class of people, and thus he had published them in the cheapest manner possible. By addressing the issues of the treatment of animals, he also hoped that the prints would help prevent some of the cruel treatment that he was witnessing in the streets of London. The 4 stages of cruelty follows the life of Tom Nero, a figure from impoverished London whose actions become increasingly cruel and violent. In the first stage, we encounter a horrifying scene as young Tom, dressed in ragged clothes, sodomizes a dog with an arrow. There's Tom. Although a boy in a nicely coiffed wig tries to restrain Tom's hand, proffering a tart as a distraction, his efforts are in vain. Tom Nero inhabits a world filled with such violence. Throughout the scene, we see horrible actions against animals. Cats have been strung up by their tails. This boy teases an emaciated dog by tying a bone to its tail. Sticks are swung at roosters. And in the distance, just up here, we see another cat who has been tossed from a window. He has been fitted with a pair of inflated bladders, as if such an attachment will keep him aloft longer. Cruelty seems central to this world. Even a pair of hands claps to cheer on a dog savaging a cat. In the next stage, Tom Nero has become a cab driver, and we witness him beating his poor horse, who has been overtaxed by the weight of the 4 fat lawyers who had crammed into the cab. As we see through vignettes of other forms of violence, cruelty towards animals is not only the province of children. In the 3rd stage, Nero has turned fully to a life of crime, having become a highway robber, and he is shown apprehended after murdering his lover. Here's Tom Nero and his lover. Her swollen belly indicates that she was pregnant with their child, and the contents of her bag and box suggest that she had become an accomplice, stealing from her mistress to aid her lover, yet she meets her end violently hacked by Nero's knife. In the last stage, entitled The Reward of Cruelty, Nero's own life ends violently. He appears laid out on the dissecting table of the hall of the Royal Company of Surgeons. The rope around his neck indicates that he has been hanged. Dissection was intended as a deterrent for criminals, and not long after Hogarth produced this drawing, the Murder Act of 1751 decreed that in no case whatsoever shall the body of any murderer be suffered to be buried, declaring instead that the body would be given over for public dissection or might be hung in chains. Hogarth's imagery, therefore, was directly in dialogue with ongoing debates over the state of society. And these myriad details, of which I've only pointed out a few, suggest the horrors of such a treatment of the body and of violence in London. But in this image, there seems to be some poetic justice, as the dog in the foreground licks Nero's heart. As it so often seems with Hogarth, no aspect goes overlooked. As the initial exploration of Bier Street suggested, despite their high level of finish, Hogarth's red chalk drawings did not necessarily represent the final designs that were transferred to copper plates. In Bier Street, that redrawn hand and saw indicated the ways that Hogarth was refining his compositions. One of the extraordinary opportunities presented by this exhibition was the chance to gather together 2 other key drawings from the 4 stages of cruelty, related to those here in the Morgan's collection. One from the first stage from the Yale Center for British Art on the left, and one from the 4th from the Royal Collection. These drawings, in conjunction with those in red chalk, shed light on Hogarth's process and the steps that he took in developing his compositions to ensure that they powerfully conveyed their social critique. The early sketch of the first stage of cruelty currently hangs next to the highly finished Morgan drawing, the first time these drawings have been together since the 18th century. Nearby, we find the print, allowing us to track the development of the composition from sketch to red chalk drawing to print, and I'll flip the print to ease comparison. Across these, the figure of the observing, we see the changes. For instance, the figure of the observing draftsman, perhaps a stand-in for Hogarth himself, who becomes more finished and detailed. The sheet from Yale, with its figures rendered in loose lines of red chalk and graphite, is strikingly different from the Morgan drawings. And we can imagine Hogarth working quickly, roughing out his ideas as fast as they come to him. Such an early iteration would have been treated by him as a working drawing, rather than as a finished product to display. We can see this from the surface of the paper. Looking at it closely, and here photographed in raking light, it's clear that the paper is a bit rumpled and creased, perhaps evidence of Hogarth hard at work in the studio. Close examination of the sheet also reveals layers of media. Hogarth began the composition by creating the urban setting. He laid out the buildings to establish the perspective of the scene using a blind stylus, which is a finely pointed instrument like a pencil, but one that does not produce a mark. It's possible to see some of the indentations if you look closely, and I encourage you to look closely upstairs. After setting up the scene and working out the perspective of the city street, Hogarth made an initial sketch with red chalk, indicating the composition's various groupings. He then went over the drawing again with graphite, furnishing details. We can already see the suggestion of ribs in the starving ground in the foreground, as well as the leer on that taunting boy's face. In other areas, Hogarth was more concerned about the overall appearance of a section of the drawing. Look at the cat, that poor cat being savaged by the dog. In the fury of the attack, the cat becomes a tangle of graphite lines. They are roughly and energetically, but evocatively sketched. The movement of Hogarth's pencil renders these animals even more animated here than they are in later iterations of the composition. Although this loose, energetic drawing is the only one of its type to survive from this series, rough sketches such as this one were a part of Hogarth's graphic practice. The British Museum holds numerous sketches for Hogarth's print series, Industry and Idleness, and I'm showing 2 drawings and a print of the 6th. In the sketch on the upper left corner, as in the drawing we were just looking at, Hogarth very carefully laid out the street scene, first using a blind stylus, following with graphite, and then finally with pen and ink. As with the first stage of Cruelty, Hogarth's primary concern is not in the individual details, but rather in the formal arrangement of figural groups. In a subsequent drawing of the subject, just to the right, done in pen and ink and wash, those details begin to gain the clarity they exhibit in the final print. Beyond creating a rough approximation of the composition, Hogarth also made edits directly on the page. For instance, with his young draftsman, he apparently wasn't happy with the initial position of the hangman in red chalk, and he moves it up in graphite. He also adjusts the position of the hand. He tries out his ideas on the sheet as well. Should that boy, the well-dressed boy who's offering a tart to Tom Narrow, should he wear a hat or should he wear a wig? And what should he do about this position at the end of the balcony? Should there be a figure there? Indeed, if we examine this balcony area as the design progresses from the Yale drawing to the Morgan drawing to the final print, we see Hogarth continuing to change his mind. From the somewhat ambiguous figure in the first drawing, perhaps a person with a basket on her head, it becomes an empty space. And then in the final print, Hogarth has added some boys torturing a bird, blinding it with a heated wire. In the final print, too, Hogarth has dramatized the lighting, casting the entire scene in shadow. What can we understand about these steps? Once Hogarth was satisfied with the overall composition of this rough sketch, he transferred elements of it onto a fresh sheet of paper. We know this because of marks on both sides of the Yale sheet. The verso of this drawing as with all of the drawings in the exhibition, has been rubbed with red chalk. This technique was a common practice for transferring designs. The red chalk-covered verso could be placed on a fresh sheet of paper, and by tracing the lines with stylus, pressing into the sheet below, the red chalk on the back of the paper would then transfer onto the fresh sheet of paper. You might have done something similar to this when you were at school in art class, maybe covering a piece of paper with graphite and then tracing it, or using a transfer paper and then tracing to offset those lines. Close examination of the recto reveals losses from these incised lines, and I'm showing just part of the architectural setting. You can make out the window here, which would appear. These losses indicate that the red chalk would have transferred onto another surface, likely the next iteration of the drawing. However, even as Hogarth made the transfer, ideas occurred to him. Most notably, if you remember that poor cat thrown out of the window, we see it again here, but only indicated in blind stylus. There's its little ears. Hogarth must have quickly sketched this while he was tracing elements of the design onto the composition. This method of transfer was frequently used by printmakers. Contemporary treatises suggest covering a copper plate with white wax. A drawing might then be placed on the surface of the plate, and when the design was traced, the red chalk from the verso of the drawing would be easily visible on the white surface, ready to be etched. The artist would then use an etching needle to scratch the design into the white wax. While we don't have the copper plate for the first stage of Cruelty, Gin Lane can help us to envision the process. The etched plate would then be placed in an acid bath, which would bite into those areas of the copper plate unprotected by wax, creating the intaglio lines. Hogarth was often dissatisfied with the initial results of the etching process, as with many printmakers, and he would use a burin to further refine the design, strengthening shadows and adding further details. The process I've just described sounds fairly linear, and looking at the two drawings and the final print together, it seems as if we can tell a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. The Yale drawing is traced onto the Morgan sheet, where details become more highly finished. Then it's transferred onto the copper plate, which is printed. Voila. But the story is not that simple. As we've studied these drawings with conservators and scholars, Hogarth's process seems to be much less linear. By overlaying digital photographs of the two drawings from the first stage, we were able to determine that the incised lines from the Yale drawing do not necessarily always line up with the red chalk lines in the Morgan sheet. Hogarth adjusted, we've made very careful measurements, and it's clear that Hogarth adjusted the setting just by millimeters, the height of the wall, the position of the door, ever so slightly between the two drawings. Moreover, there are elements of the Yale drawing that Hogarth had traced with a stylus that do not appear in the Morgan drawing. For example, we can see that the clapping hands of the man on the right were carefully traced, and if you look upstairs, you can see the incised lines. But in the Morgan drawings, these clapping hands have shifted to the right, appearing disembodied. And in the final print, they have shifted back once more, again attached to the body, though this time the clapping fellow has a broad-brimmed hat. Hogarth is constantly tweaking the drawing. We also need to consider the high level of finish of the Morgan drawing, where even every brick is drawn. Progressing from the rough Yale drawing to this highly finished work would have been a substantial jump to make in the development of such a complex composition. Thus, while undoubtedly these represent two stages of the process, they likely don't represent the only stages. The excellent condition of the Morgan drawing, too, suggests that it might not have been the composition used to transfer the design onto the plate. Understanding Hogarth's design process for the series becomes further complicated by a drawing for the fourth stage of Cruelty, the scene in which Tom Nero meets his horrifying end. One of Hogarth's aims with the stages of Cruelty, as he described, was to address the lower class of people. And in an effort to broaden his audience, he experimented with a method of printing that he'd never used before, woodcuts. Easier to ink, Faster to print and more durable than copper plates, woodcuts could be produced in a greater quantity, thus hopefully resulting in much cheaper prints, more affordable to the lower classes and the people that he wanted to reach. Hogarth hired a block cutter, whose name was Bell, to cut wood blocks for the third and fourth stages of Cruelty, which were first printed in January 1751, before the publication of the full set of 4 engravings. Ultimately, though, Hogarth was not satisfied with the results and was unable to print them to his satisfaction, perhaps due to his unfamiliarity with the process. He seems to have printed a few proof impressions, and I'm showing some here from the Lewis Walpole Library, but none were sold during his lifetime. The woodcuts upstairs were printed in the 1790s by John Boydell, who acquired the blocks after Hogarth's death. We know little about where in the design process for the series these woodcuts fell. The blocks and the resulting prints are about 3 inches larger on either side than the composition Hogarth produced for the copper plate. And the red chalk drawings for the third and fourth stages are squared. You can see some graphite lines lined here. This suggests that Hogarth had used a grid probably to enlarge the design, either onto another sheet of paper or even directly onto the block. When we compare the woodcut to the red chalk drawing and to the intaglio print, we see that the 3 contain nearly all of the same details and the same figures. There are very few differences between them, and they must be closely related. However, the drawing in the Royal Collection looks as if it's designed for a woodcut, and suggests that at some point, other compositional options were considered, and that Hogarth used a different medium and a larger scale to consider those options. This drawing, in pen and ink with some gray wash, has the openness and linearity of a woodcut. But beyond aesthetics, the composition has significant differences to the final print. Rather than occurring under the aegis of the Royal Company of Surgeons, indicated by that coat of arms, and overseen by the head surgeon, this space is more generic and indeed less hierarchical. None of the observers wear academic dress, and in the drawing, Nero's stomach is passed around. Did Hogarth create a new version of the composition as he conceived of the woodcut, or was the idea for this scene in his mind even before the red chalk drawings? Could this have even been one of his earliest ideas, an exploration of punishment by dissection before conceiving a backstory for the man whose body is laid out on the table? I think that the latter is more likely the case, as he already looks towards changing the composition. On the right-hand edge of the paper, there's just a hint in graphite of the chief surgeon sitting in his chair, as if Hogarth had decided at some point that he needed someone to oversee the scene. Since the woodcuts were first printed a month before the etched and engraved prints were sold, Hogarth might well have conceived of this scene earlier. But the consistent designs between the final woodcut, the red chalk drawing, and the print suggest that well before Hogarth had printed the woodcut, he had worked out the design in the slightly smaller red chalk format. Creating these prints clearly involved a great deal of back and forth, and drawings must have been made both in series and in tandem as he conceived of the 2 different sets of prints. The best example of Hogarth's constant revision in the drawings is seen in the Bier Street drawing. Unlike its companion, Gin Lane, this drawing shows evidence for multiple substantial changes. At the center of the drawing, Hogarth has added a sedan chair in graphite, along with 2 carriers who have set down the chair in order to refresh themselves with beer. It's hard to make this out in the drawing, but in the print, we see a woman whose wide skirt has been squeezed into the tight space of the chair. She looks none too happy that her carriers are taking a break. In the drawing, Hogarth did not need a high level of finish to convey what he wanted. All he needed was some quickly drawn lines to capture the scene, which then were perhaps transferred directly onto the copper plate or onto another drawing. Most strikingly, however, just to the right of this vignette, we see, somewhat eerily, a floating, disembodied hand. This is not evidence of the supernatural. Comparison with the first state of the print indicates that this hand should belong to a waifish Frenchman who has been hoisted by a stout British beer drinker. The way that the hand is cut off in the drawing, with this straight line here, which runs down the drawing itself, indicates that Hogarth must have placed a flap here to redraw this section of the composition. And then the flap might have looked something like this. In fact, many other details differ in this section of the print. The beer drinkers became stouter, and the artist, in the midst of painting a sign, becomes thinner, and his clothes more ragged. What was initially simply a scene of cheerful prosperity becomes perhaps more pointedly political, where Hogarth expresses his anti-French sentiments and draws attention to the plight of the impoverished artist. Yet rather than start on a fresh sheet completely, he simply reworked the composition with a flap of paper over the page. Elsewhere, other portions of the composition changed from drawing to print. The shoe seller has been replaced by a plump, sweating beer drinker and a pile of books. Perhaps he was added with a flap as well, it's difficult to tell. Or maybe Hogarth changed the composition right on the copper plate. These reworkings were not the final ones. Hogarth substantially altered the plate of Bier Street several years after it was first published, producing a third state, which we see on the right. He took out the skinny Frenchman and replaced him with a joint of mutton. The mutton is here. And filling in the foreground, he added an amorous couple, the woman suggestively fingering a large key. Such edits would have required scraping off areas of the plate to re-etch and engrave them. And in this labor-intensive process, the red chalk drawing might have even served as a useful guide and a reference point. Indeed, given all the changes between this drawing and the later state of the print, one wonders how many other drawings Hogarth had to produce of this subject. The group of 6 sheets in the Morgans collection demonstrate the myriad ways that Hogarth was using red chalk drawings, as compositions to develop ideas, as finished representations of a composition, and as the basis for subsequent designs. Even as they often have a finished appearance, they were drawings that he returned to and reworked. Within Hogarth's diverse oeuvre, they also stand out as a group, for apart from a period in the late 1740s and early 1750s when these drawings were made, his use of red chalk was relatively rare. When Hogarth wrote notes for his autobiography later in his life, he reflected on the prints for Gin Lane, Bier Street, and the 4 Stages of Cruelty. He said that they, quote, had neither great correctness of drawing or fine engraving were at all necessary. On the contrary, that would have set the price of them out of reach for those for whom they were chiefly intended. That is to say, that the effort that had gone into producing a series like the Rake's Progress would have made prints such as these too expensive for broad consumption. Although Hogarth downplays the fineness of the works within his oeuvre, I am skeptical of his dismissal of this great correctness of drawing. For the use of red chalk is very particular and is used in all of these drawings with great care and precision. Think of the careful reworking of the saw in Gin Lane, or the exacting representation of the bricks in the 1st Stage of Cruelty. In this period of the 18th century, highly finished drawing in red chalk is most closely associated with artistic production in France. This is not to say that red chalk was not used in Britain, and in the cosmopolitan artistic culture of London, artists used a range of materials for drawing. Although Hogarth himself touted anti-French sentiments, he studied with French artists, employed French engravers for his most expensive prints, and made 2 visits to France, the second occurring in 1748. Of Hogarth's known drawings, those in red chalk predominantly date after this second visit to France. And along with the drawings in the exhibition upstairs, these red chalk drawings include ones produced in preparation for prints after two of his historical subjects. Moses before Pharaoh's daughter, painted in 1746 for the Foundling Hospital, and Paul before Felix, the large history painting he had produced for the lawyers of Lincoln's Inn Fields in 1748. Unlike the socially oriented prints, which Hogarth engraved himself, for these two prints after history paintings, he asked Luke Sullivan, an engraver with whom he had worked before, to produce the engravings. Hogarth's red chalk drawings presumably served as an aid in these engravings productions. Indeed, other printmakers made drawings in red chalk to prepare plates after Hogarth's work. When Hogarth placed the advertisement for the subscription to these prints in May of 1751, shortly after Bier Street and Gin Lane and the Four Stages of Cruelty, the advertisement noted that, quote, "Subscriptions will be taken till the 6th of June next, and no longer, at the Golden Head in Leicester Fields, where the drawings may be seen." I paused when I read that the drawings would be placed on display. This clearly indicates that they were in Hogarth's studio, ready to be looked at. Since the large history paintings were already installed elsewhere in London, the red chalk drawings could serve as stand-ins to be examined by those considering subscribing for the two prints after two of Hogarth's most ambitious history subjects. While the drawings for Paul before Felix and Moses brought before Pharaoh's daughter gave potential subscribers a taste for how prints might appear, the drawings for Bier Street, Gin Lane, and the Four Stages of Cruelty might have acted as records of another kind, stand-ins for the painted compositions that Hogarth never made for these works, but more typically advertised with. And he never intended to make a painting. But with his social agenda and the need to keep costs down, Hogarth did not have the time to work up complete paintings, but he might have wanted to have an original work of art, so to speak, to relate to the finished prints. For even as he claimed to seek a wide audience for these subjects, he also catered to the connoisseur. Although it was possible to buy a print for $1, he also advertised that a number will be printed in a better manner for the curious at $1 6d each. Sold from the Golden Head, displayed alongside all of Hogarth's works there, the prints were sold from the Golden Head and displayed alongside all of Hogarth's works there. The red chalk drawings could have assumed the role of the original design, analogous to that of the paintings for the Rake's Progress. They would be there to be examined by connoisseurs. By rendering the composition in red chalk, he had something of a finer work of art to show off, something more ambitious than a work for an illustration. The Morgans' red chalk drawings were certainly used as working drawings. We've seen that. They were drawings that Hogarth could return to again and again as he refined and developed his compositions. But they were also one more proof of his authorship, important for an artist who fought to assert his intellectual ownership over the compositions he designed. If we envision them in Hogarth's studio, close to his drawings for Paul before Felix and Moses brought before Pharaoh's daughter, these Morgan drawings become more deeply linked to Hogarth's other ambitious projects. At the same time, they are in and of themselves progresses, fitting for the artist of modern moral subjects. Thank you.